They said Alessandro Romano's empire was built on blood. But when he kidnapped his enemy's sister, he never expected the only war he would lose was against his own heart. The scream that shattered the midnight silence belonged to Isabella Moretti, though no one would hear it except the man who had orchestrated her terror. One moment she had been walking from her evening shift at the hospital where she worked as a trauma nurse. Her mind focused on the patients she had helped save, and the lives that hung in balance between skilled hands and divine intervention. The next moment, strong arms had lifted her from the sidewalk as easily as if she weighed nothing, and the world she knew disappeared into the darkness of a waiting car. Alessandro Romano watched, from the shadows as his men executed the plan he had crafted, with the precision that had built his empire from the streets of Chicago into a network that spanned 3 continents. Every detail had been calculated, every variable accounted for, every potential complication anticipated and neutralized before it could interfere with the night's objectives. Isabella Moretti was not just any woman. She was the sister of Marco Moretti, the man who had destroyed Alessandro's family, stolen his father's business, and left the Romano name buried beneath accusations of betrayal and cowardice that had taken Alessandro 15 years to overcome. Tonight was the first payment on a debt that could only be settled in blood, fear, and the systematic destruction of everything Marco held dear. But as Alessandro studied Isabella through the tinted windows of his car, he found himself unprepared for the reality of his enemy's sister. She was beautiful in a way that spoke of strength rather than fragility, with dark hair that caught the streetlights and eyes that blazed with intelligence and fury even in the midst of terror. This was not the spoiled princess he had expected to find, but a woman whose very presence seemed to challenge his assumptions about the Moretti family and their capacity for honor. Isabella fought her, captors with the trained efficiency of someone who had spent years working in emergency medicine, knowing exactly how to apply pressure to joints and nerve points that could disable attackers twice her size. But she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered by men who had been expecting resistance, and her medical training was no match for professional soldiers who had learned to subdue targets without causing permanent damage. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Whatever you want from my family, this isn't the way to get it." Alessandro found himself studying her face, noting the absence of tears or pleas for mercy that he had expected from someone in her position. Isabella Moretti was afraid. He could see it in the rapid pulse at her throat and the careful way she was assessing her surroundings for escape routes. But she was not broken by fear. If anything, terror seemed to sharpen her focus rather than scatter it. "Miss Moretti," Alessandro said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout his rise to power. "You are not in a position to make demands." Isabella turned toward the sound of his voice, her eyes adjusting to the darkness enough to make out his silhouette against the city lights streaming past the car windows. "Who are you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer would not be reassuring. "I am the man your brother wronged," Alessandro replied simply. "And you are the price he will pay for his betrayal." The words were delivered with cold precision, each syllable calculated to instill the kind of fear that would make her compliant and manageable during the days to come. But as Alessandro watched Isabella's reaction to his threat, he saw not submission, but a flash of something that looked almost like protective anger. "My brother is a good man," she said firmly. "If you have some grievance against him, take it up with him directly instead of terrorizing innocent people." Alessandro felt something unexpected stir in his chest at her defense of Marco, a recognition that this woman's loyalty to her family was both admirable and potentially problematic for his plans. He had anticipated that kidnapping Isabella would be a strategic maneuver that would force Marco to negotiate from a position of weakness. He had not anticipated that she would be someone whose character might complicate his ability to use her as leverage without experiencing unwelcome emotional consequences. "Innocence," Alessandro observed, "is a luxury that no one in your family can claim." The car pulled through the gates of a property that had been designed to be both beautiful and impregnable, with manicured gardens that concealed sophisticated security systems and architectural elegance that masked the reality of armed guards and electronic surveillance. This was Alessandro's primary residence, the fortress where he conducted business that could not be. discussed in public venues and entertained guests who could never speak of what they witnessed within its walls. Isabella took in her surroundings with the trained, observational skills of someone whose profession required rapid assessment of complex situations under pressure. She noted the height of the walls, the positions of security cameras, the number of men who moved through the property with the disciplined coordination of military personnel. This was not a temporary hiding place but a permanent stronghold, which meant her captivity was likely to last longer than she had initially hoped. "Welcome to your new home, Miss Moretti," Alessandro said as they approached the main entrance of the villa. "I trust you will find the accommodations more comfortable than you might expect." Isabella looked at the man who had ordered her kidnapping, seeing not the monster she had imagined, but someone whose presence commanded attention through sheer force of personality, rather than obvious displays of violence. Alessandro Romano was younger than she had expected, perhaps early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance and behavior with analytical precision. He was handsome in the way that dangerous men often were, with features that suggested both intelligence and ruthlessness, and a bearing that spoke of someone accustomed to absolute authority over his environment and everyone in it. But there was something in his expression when he looked at her that seemed almost like curiosity, as if she represented a puzzle he was interested in solving rather than simply an asset to be managed. "This is kidnapping," Isabella said as they entered the villa, her voice steady despite the fear that was making her heart race. "It's a federal crime that will bring law enforcement attention you can't possibly want." "Law enforcement," Alessandro replied with a slight smile that held no warmth, "is rarely interested in investigating crimes against the Moretti family. Your brother's reputation precedes him in ways that make official sympathy difficult to obtain." The statement was delivered with such casual confidence that Isabella realized this man had indeed thought through every aspect of her abduction, including the likelihood that authorities would prioritize finding her over, avoiding entanglement in what appeared to be a matter of organized crime family business, as Alessandro led her through corridors lined with artwork that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Isabella found herself studying not just her physical surroundings but the character of the man who had orchestrated her capture. He moved through his domain with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable with power. Yet there was something in the way he occasionally glanced at her that suggested her presence was affecting him in ways he had not anticipated. "Your room is on the second floor," Alessandro informed her as they approached a staircase that curved upward with architectural elegance. "You will find everything you need for your comfort, though I would recommend against testing the security measures. They are designed to be both effective and unforgiving." Isabella paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at Alessandro with an expression that mixed defiance with something that might have been disappointment. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. "What turned you into someone who thinks terrorizing innocent people is an acceptable way to settle grievances?" The question caught Alessandro off guard, hitting closer to memories and pain than he was prepared to confront in the presence of his captive. "Your brother," he said simply. "Your brother is what happened to me. But in the silence of captivity, something stirs that neither of them can explain." Isabella's room was a study in contradictions that perfectly captured the strange nature of her captivity. The space was larger than her apartment, furnished with antiques that belonged in museums, and decorated with fresh flowers that suggested someone had anticipated her arrival with careful attention to creating a comfortable environment. But the windows were fitted with security glass that could not be broken, the door locked from the outside with electronic systems that required keycard access, and every detail of the room's luxury could not disguise the fact that it was fundamentally a prison designed to look like a palace. Isabella explored her golden cage with the systematic thoroughness that had made her an excellent trauma nurse, cataloging every detail that might provide information about her captors or opportunities for escape. The bathroom was stocked with expensive toiletries. The closet contained clothing in her size that suggested weeks of planning, and the bookshelf held novels that revealed someone had researched her reading preferences. With disturbing accuracy, it was the small touches that unsettled her most. The fact that her coffee was prepared exactly as she preferred it, that the temperature in the room was set to the precise degree she found comfortable, that the clothes provided included not just elegant dresses, but practical items like jeans and sweaters that aligned with her usual casual style. Alessandro Romano had not simply kidnapped her. He had studied her habits, preferences, and lifestyle, with the kind of detailed attention that spoke of either professional thoroughness or personal interest that went beyond strategic necessity. The realization that her captor knew intimate details about her daily life was both frightening and strangely compelling in ways that Isabella didn't want to examine too closely. Her first attempt to escape came within hours of her arrival, when she tested the security measures with the kind of creative problem-solving that had served her well in medical emergencies. The windows were indeed unbreakable, the door's electronic locks were beyond her ability to manipulate, and the ventilation system was too small to accommodate human passage. But more significantly, her escape attempts were being monitored with such precision that Alessandro appeared within minutes of her initial exploration, his expression mixing amusement with something that looked almost like admiration for her resourcefulness. "Dr. Isabella Moretti," he said, using her professional title in a way that suggested respect rather than mockery. "Trauma nurse, volunteer coordinator for medical missions to underserved communities, and apparently someone with more tactical intelligence than I anticipated." Isabella studied his face, noting that he seemed genuinely interested in her professional accomplishments rather than simply cataloging her resume for strategic purposes. "You've done your homework," she observed. "I make it a point to understand people who matter to my objectives," Alessandro replied, "though I admit you are proving to be more complex than my research suggested." The comment was delivered with a slight smile that transformed his entire appearance, revealing glimpses of charm beneath the dangerous authority that marked his usual demeanor. Isabella found herself momentarily distracted by how different he looked when his expression held warmth rather than cold calculation. "What do you want from me?" Isabella asked directly. Alessandro was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the magnetic presence he seemed to project without effort. "Initially," he said carefully, "I wanted leverage against your brother, a way to force him into negotiations from a position of weakness rather than strength." "And now?" Isabella pressed, sensing that his motivations might be evolving in ways that neither of them had anticipated. "Now," Alessandro replied, his voice carrying undertones that made her breath catch, "I find myself reconsidering whether leverage is what I actually want from you." The confession was delivered with such quiet intensity that Isabella felt something shift in the atmosphere between them, as if they were no longer captor and prisoner, but two people discovering an attraction that complicated everything they thought they understood about their situation. "I'm not staying here willingly," Isabella said, though her voice lacked the conviction she had intended. "I know," Alessandro replied gently, "but I hope that will change." The statement was presumptuous and arrogant, but it was also delivered with a vulnerability that suggested Alessandro was revealing more about his desires than he had planned to share. Over the following days, Isabella found herself engaged in a strange dance of resistance and reluctant fascination with her captor. Alessandro visited her room regularly, bringing meals that had been prepared by professional chefs, and engaging her in conversations that ranged from literature to philosophy to her work in trauma medicine. He was an excellent conversationalist, well-educated and genuinely interested in her thoughts on topics that had nothing to do with his criminal enterprises or her family connections. He asked thoughtful questions about her medical training, expressed intelligent curiosity about her volunteer work, and demonstrated a breadth of knowledge that suggested someone who read widely and thought deeply about issues beyond his immediate business concerns. But more intriguingly, Alessandro seemed to be studying her not as a captive to be managed, but as a woman whose character and intelligence genuinely fascinated him. He remembered details from their conversations, followed up on topics she had mentioned in passing, and began bringing her books and magazines that aligned with interests she had expressed. "Why are you doing this?" Isabella asked during one of their evening conversations, gesturing toward the fresh flowers that appeared in her room each morning, and the gourmet meals that were served on china rather than prison trays. "Because you deserve to be treated with respect." Alessandro replied simply. "I'm your prisoner," Isabella pointed out. "You are my guest," Alessandro corrected. "An involuntary guest, but someone whose presence in my home should be marked by courtesy rather than cruelty." Isabella studied his face, trying to determine whether his apparent consideration was genuine or simply another form of psychological manipulation designed to make her more compliant with his objectives. "This isn't normal kidnapper behavior," she observed. Alessandro's smile was enigmatic. "I've never been accused of being normal," but it was during their third week together that Isabella began to suspect Alessandro's interest in her went far beyond strategic considerations or even personal attraction. She had been reading in her room when she heard the sound of piano music drifting up from the floors. Below, complex classical pieces played with extraordinary skill and emotional depth. Curiosity, overcoming caution, Isabella made her way downstairs, following the music to a room she had not previously seen, where Alessandro sat at a grand piano, his fingers moving across the keys with the kind of practiced grace that spoke of years of serious training. He was playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, and his interpretation was both flawless and deeply emotional in ways that revealed aspects of his character she had never suspected. "You play beautifully," Isabella said softly when the piece concluded. Alessandro turned toward her voice, his expression cycling through surprise, pleasure, and something that looked almost like embarrassment at being discovered in a moment of vulnerability. "My mother insisted on lessons," he said, as if apologizing for revealing a talent that didn't align with his reputation for ruthless efficiency. "She had excellent taste," Isabella replied, "and you have extraordinary skill." The compliment was genuine, and Alessandro seemed to recognize her sincerity in a way that made him look younger and less guarded than she had ever seen him. "Would you like to hear something else?" he asked, and Isabella heard in his voice the tentative hope of someone offering to share something precious and personal. "Very much," Isabella replied, settling into a chair near the piano. What followed was an hour of music that revealed layers of Alessandro's character that his reputation had never hinted at. Sensitivity, artistry, and a capacity for beauty that seemed at odds with everything she thought she knew about organized crime leaders. What happens when a prisoner's heart begins to betray her fear? The arguments began during their fourth week together, sparked by Isabella's growing frustration with her captivity, but fueled by an undercurrent of attraction that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. What started as disputes about the ethics of kidnapping evolved into philosophical debates about justice, loyalty, and the moral compromises that desperate circumstances could force on otherwise honorable people. "You can't justify holding me prisoner by claiming it's for some greater good," Isabella argued during one of their heated exchanges in the library where they had taken to spending their evenings. "Wrong doesn't become right just because you have noble motivations." "And what would you have me do?" Alessandro replied, his voice carrying frustration that seemed directed as much at himself as at her. "Allow your brother to continue destroying innocent families while I pursue justice through legal channels that he has already corrupted?" Isabella studied his face, noting the genuine anger and pain that underlay his justifications for actions she could never approve of. "What did my brother do to you?" she asked quietly, her professional instincts recognizing someone whose behavior was driven by unprocessed trauma rather than simple cruelty. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through emotions that suggested he was debating whether to reveal information that would make him vulnerable to someone he should consider an enemy. "He destroyed my father," Alessandro said finally, his voice carrying years of suppressed grief and rage. "Marco used his position in the district attorney's office to frame my father for crimes he didn't commit, then stood by while public opinion and legal proceedings destroyed everything my family had built over 3 generations." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest as she processed this information, understanding for the first time that Alessandro's actions were motivated by a quest for justice rather than simple criminal ambition. "My father died in prison," Alessandro continued, his voice barely above a whisper, alone, disgraced, and convinced that his son believed the lies that had been spread about his character. "I was 22 years old and I watched the only good man I had ever known die thinking he had failed everyone who had ever trusted him." The pain in Alessandro's voice was so raw and immediate that Isabella found herself wanting to comfort him despite the circumstances of their relationship. "I'm sorry," she said softly, meaning it completely. "I can't imagine how devastating that must have been." Alessandro looked at her with surprise, as if he had expected judgment rather than empathy from someone whose captivity he had orchestrated. "Your sympathy is unexpected," he admitted. "Loss is loss," Isabella replied. "Pain doesn't become less real because of who experiences it or what circumstances created it." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, as Alessandro began sharing aspects of his history that revealed the man he had been before grief, and the quest for vengeance had shaped him into someone capable of kidnapping innocent people. He told her about his father's legitimate business empire, built on construction and real estate development that had provided honest employment for hundreds of families. He described growing up in a household where integrity and service to community were valued above profit, where success was measured in contributions to society rather than personal accumulation of wealth or power. "I was going to be a teacher," Alessandro admitted during one of their late-night conversations. "Classical literature, maybe university-level courses on European history. I had been accepted to graduate programs, had plans for a life that involved education rather than this." Isabella tried to imagine Alessandro in a classroom, discussing literature with students who would have been captivated by his intelligence and passion for learning. The image fit surprisingly well with the man who played Chopin with such sensitivity and discussed books with genuine intellectual curiosity. "What changed?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Marco destroyed those dreams along with everything else," Alessandro replied bitterly. "It's difficult to pursue academic careers when your family name is associated with organized crime and corruption, when background checks reveal that your father died in federal prison." Isabella felt her heart break for the young man who had lost, not just his father but his entire future, because of circumstances beyond his control. "So, you decided to become what people already thought you were," she observed. "I decided to survive," Alessandro corrected, "and to build the resources necessary to someday prove my father's innocence and make the people responsible pay for what they had done." The conversations revealed layers of Alessandro's character that made it increasingly difficult for Isabella to maintain her emotional distance from him. She began to see that his criminal empire had been built not from greed or power hunger, but from a desperate need to accumulate enough influence to challenge the legal system that had destroyed his family. But more troubling than her growing understanding of his motivations was her increasing attraction to the man himself. Alessandro was intelligent, cultured, and capable of extraordinary gentleness, despite his reputation for ruthlessness. He treated her with consistent respect, engaged her in conversations that challenged her intellect, and demonstrated a capacity for vulnerability that made her want to comfort rather than condemn him. "I should hate you," Isabella told him during one of their evening discussions. "Yes," Alessandro agreed quietly. "You should." "But I don't," Isabella continued, the admission feeling both dangerous and inevitable. "I should be afraid of you, angry at you, focused entirely on escaping from you. Instead, I find myself looking forward to our conversations, enjoying your company, feeling connected to you in ways that make no sense given our circumstances." Alessandro's expression intensified, his blue eyes holding hers with an intimacy that made her pulse race. "Isabella," he said, her name spoken like a prayer, "you have no idea how completely you have disrupted every plan I made, every strategy I developed, every assumption I held about what I wanted from this situation." The confession was delivered with such raw honesty that Isabella felt her remaining defenses begin to crumble. "What do you want now?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for his answer. Alessandro moved closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the conflict playing across his features as he struggled with feelings that clearly threatened everything he thought he understood about himself and his objectives. "I want you to choose to stay," he said finally. "Not as my prisoner, but as someone who understands me in ways that no one else ever has. Someone who sees the man I was before grief turned me into what I am now." The request was impossible, presumptuous, and delivered with such desperate longing that Isabella felt her heart race with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. Could love bloom in the soil of hatred? The news arrived on a Tuesday morning when Isabella was having breakfast in the garden, enjoying the illusion of normalcy that Alessandro had created within the boundaries of her beautiful prison. One of his men approached with the kind of urgency that immediately commanded attention, speaking in rapid Italian that Isabella couldn't understand, but whose tone suggested serious developments in the outside world. Alessandro's expression darkened as he absorbed the information, his entire demeanor shifting from the relaxed charm he had been displaying during their meal to the cold calculation that had built his empire and eliminated his enemies. "What is it?" Isabella asked, though she suspected the news involved her family and would not be anything she wanted to hear. "Your brother," Alessandro replied grimly, "has mobilized significant resources to secure your release. He's been reaching out to federal authorities, hiring private security firms, and making threats against anyone he suspects of involvement in your disappearance." Isabella felt a complex mixture of emotions at this information: relief that Marco cared enough to search for her, fear about what his investigation might uncover, and an unexpected concern for Alessandro's safety that surprised her with its intensity. "That's what brothers do," she said carefully. "They protect their sisters." "That's what brothers who aren't career criminals do," Alessandro corrected. Marco's version of protection involves leveraging his connections in law enforcement to authorize raids on properties belonging to anyone he considers a potential enemy. Isabella studied Alessandro's face, noting the tension that had replaced his usual confident composure. "Are you in immediate danger?" she asked, surprised by how much her concern for his welfare seemed to outweigh her hope for rescue. Alessandro's expression softened at her question, as if he had not expected his captive to worry about his safety. "Not immediate danger," he replied, "but Marco's investigation is forcing me to accelerate timelines for negotiations that I had hoped to conduct at a more measured pace." "What kind of negotiations?" Isabella pressed. Alessandro was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much information to share with someone whose loyalties should theoretically lie with her family rather than her captor. "I want your brother to publicly acknowledge my father's innocence and reveal the evidence that would clear his name," Alessandro said finally. "In exchange, I would be willing to discuss terms for ending the hostilities between our families." Isabella absorbed this information, understanding for the first time that her kidnapping had been intended as the opening move in a complex negotiation, rather than simply an act of revenge. "And if he refuses?" she asked. Alessandro's expression grew cold in ways that reminded Isabella exactly how dangerous the man who had been treating her with such gentle consideration could become when his interests were threatened. "Then I will use every resource at my disposal to expose his corruption, destroy his career, and ensure that the Moretti family name becomes synonymous with the same kind of disgrace that he visited upon my father." The threat was delivered with quiet certainty, but Isabella could see the conflict in Alessandro's eyes as he weighed his desire for justice against what she was beginning to suspect was his growing reluctance to use her as leverage against her family. "You could let me go," Isabella suggested quietly. "You could release me and pursue your vendetta against Marco without involving innocent people in your family's conflict." Alessandro stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through emotions that seemed to surprise him with their intensity. "I could," he agreed, "but doing so would eliminate my primary advantage in negotiations and ensure that Marco has no incentive to cooperate with my demands for justice." "So you won't," Isabella concluded, though she heard disappointment rather than anger in her own voice. "I can't," Alessandro corrected, his voice carrying pain that suggested the decision was costing him more than he had anticipated. "Not yet. Not until I have some assurance that my father's name can be cleared, and the people responsible for his death face appropriate consequences." Isabella understood the logic of his position even as she recognized the impossibility of her situation. She was caught between loyalty to her brother and sympathy for Alessandro's quest for justice, between her desire for freedom and her growing emotional connection to the man who had made her captivity feel less like imprisonment and more like an extended conversation with someone who understood her in ways that no one else ever had. But it was that evening, when Alessandro appeared at her door with an expression of grim determination that she had never seen before, that Isabella realized her feelings for her. Captor had evolved far beyond sympathy or Stockholm syndrome into something that felt dangerously close to love. "There's been a development," Alessandro said without preamble. "Marco has discovered the location of this property. He's planning a raid for tomorrow night, with sufficient firepower to neutralize any resistance he encounters." Isabella felt her heart stop as she processed the implications of this information. "You're going to run," she said, though she wasn't sure whether the prospect of escape or separation from Alessandro caused her greater distress. "I'm going to fight," Alessandro corrected. "This property contains evidence that could prove my father's innocence. Documents that Marco destroyed the originals of, but that I have spent 15 years recovering from other sources. I won't abandon that material, even to preserve my own life." "Alessandro," Isabella said desperately, "you can't fight federal agents. That's not a battle you can win, no matter how many resources you have." "Perhaps not," Alessandro agreed. "But I can ensure that Marco pays an appropriate price for his years of corruption, even if that price includes my own life." Isabella stared at him, realizing that he was preparing for what he expected to be a final confrontation with her family, one that would likely result in his death, but might also accomplish his goal of exposing Marco's crimes. "There's another way," she said quietly, an idea forming in her mind that was both desperate and potentially foolish. "What way?" Alessandro asked. "Let me go to Marco," Isabella suggested. "Let me serve as a negotiator between you and my family, someone who can present your evidence and argue for a peaceful resolution that doesn't require anyone to die." Alessandro studied her face, his expression mixing hope with skepticism about her willingness to advocate for his interests against her own family. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Why would you risk your relationship with your brother to help the man who kidnapped you?" Isabella looked at Alessandro, seeing not the criminal who had orchestrated her abduction, but the man who had shared his music, his books, and his deepest pain with someone who should have been his enemy. "Because," she said quietly, "somewhere along the way I stopped seeing you as my captor and started seeing you as someone I care about more than I should, more than makes sense, more than I ever intended." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, weighted with implications that neither of them had been prepared to confront. If he lets her go, he loses power. If he keeps her, he loses himself. The documents were spread across Alessandro's private study like pieces of a puzzle that had taken 15 years to assemble, each page representing months or years of investigation, bribery, and careful manipulation of sources who possessed fragments of the truth about what had really happened to his father. Isabella studied the evidence with the analytical attention that had made her an excellent trauma nurse, recognizing immediately that Alessandro possessed proof of prosecutorial misconduct, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation that would not only exonerate his father, but would likely result in criminal charges against Marco and several other officials in the district attorney's office. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly, her voice carrying amazement at the scope and thoroughness of Alessandro's investigation. "You have enough evidence here to not only clear your father's name, but to expose systematic corruption that could reform the entire judicial system." "I know," Alessandro replied, his voice carrying 15 years of pain and determination, "which is why I can't allow Marco's raid to succeed. This evidence represents the only chance my father will ever have for vindication." Isabella continued reviewing the documents, noting the dates, witness statements, and forensic analyses that painted a picture of deliberate conspiracy to destroy an innocent man whose only crime had been refusing to participate in construction kickbacks and political payoffs that funded Marco's rise to power. "My God," she whispered as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Marco didn't just frame your father for crimes he didn't commit. He used your father's refusal to participate in corruption as evidence that he was secretly working with rival criminal organizations." "Exactly," Alessandro confirmed grimly. "My father's integrity was transformed into evidence of guilt, and his attempts to cooperate with legitimate authorities were presented as proof that he was trying to eliminate competition through law enforcement channels." Isabella felt sick as she realized the elegant cruelty of the frame job that had destroyed Alessandro's family, Marco had essentially made virtue into evidence of criminality, ensuring that any attempt by Alessandro's father to defend himself would only seem to confirm the charges against him. "How did you discover all this?" Isabella asked, gesturing toward the mountain of evidence that represented more investigative work than most law enforcement agencies conducted on major cases. Alessandro's expression grew distant as he considered how to explain 15 years of single-minded obsession with uncovering the truth. "I started by following the money," he said finally. "Every corrupt transaction leaves traces, and I had resources to hire investigators who could access financial records that legitimate authorities either couldn't or wouldn't examine." He moved to a wall map that showed connections between various individuals, organizations, and transactions that had facilitated the conspiracy against his father. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that Marco hadn't destroyed all the evidence of his corruption. He had hidden it, preserved it as insurance against his co-conspirators who might someday try to eliminate him as a liability. Isabella studied the map, noting the complex web of relationships that connected judges, prosecutors, police officials, and business leaders in a network of mutual dependence and shared culpability. "Where did you find Marco's insurance files?" she asked. "In a safety deposit box registered under his ex-wife's maiden name," Alessandro replied. "It took me 12 years to identify the location and another 2 years to gain access, but the contents provided the final pieces of evidence I needed to prove my father's innocence." Isabella continued studying the documents, but her attention was increasingly drawn to Alessandro's face as he explained his investigation. She could see the cost that 15 years of obsessive pursuit of justice had extracted from him. The isolation, the moral compromises, the gradual transformation from someone who had wanted to teach literature into someone capable of building a criminal empire to fund his quest for truth. "Alessandro," she said quietly, "what happened to the man who wanted to be a teacher?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, forcing him to confront aspects of himself that he had buried beneath layers of calculated ruthlessness and strategic thinking. "He died with my father," Alessandro replied after a long pause. "Or maybe he's still there, buried so deeply under years of anger and planning for revenge that I'm not sure he can be recovered." Isabella moved closer to him, close enough to see the vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior. "I don't think he died," she said softly. "I think he's been waiting for someone to remind him that justice doesn't have to come at the cost of everything good about who you used to be." Alessandro stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, longing, and something that looked almost like hope. "You see goodness in me that I'm not sure exists anymore," he said. "I see goodness in you that I know exists," Isabella corrected. "I've seen it in the way you play music, in the books you choose to read, in the way you treat me with respect despite the circumstances that brought us together. That man, the one who values beauty and learning and human dignity, he's still there." Alessandro reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing her cheek with such gentleness that Isabella felt her breath catch. "Isabella," he said, her name spoken like a confession, "you have become more important to me than revenge, more precious than justice, more essential than the vindication I have spent 15 years pursuing." The admission was delivered with such raw honesty that Isabella felt tears gather in her eyes. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that somewhere in the process of trying to prove that love and loyalty still matter in this world. You taught me what those words actually mean," Alessandro replied, his voice breaking with emotion he had kept buried for years. "I'm saying that I love you, Isabella Moretti, and that loving you has reminded me who I was before grief and anger turned me into someone I'm not sure I recognize anymore." Isabella felt her heart race as she processed his confession, understanding that he was not simply declaring romantic feelings, but admitting that she had fundamentally altered his understanding of what mattered most in life. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both inevitable and impossible given their circumstances. "I love who you are beneath all the pain and planning for revenge. I love the man who plays Chopin and discusses literature and treats his enemies' sisters with more kindness than they deserve." They stood there in his study, surrounded by 15 years of evidence and planning for vengeance, holding each other like two people who had discovered something worth preserving in a world that seemed designed to destroy everything beautiful and good. And in that moment, fear begins to turn into something else entirely. The shift in their relationship became obvious immediately, transforming every interaction between them with an intimacy that went far beyond the physical attraction they had been trying to ignore. Alessandro's protectiveness toward Isabella evolved from strategic necessity into genuine devotion. While her concern for his welfare began to outweigh her desire for freedom in ways that surprised them both. But it was the morning, after their mutual confession, that Alessandro made a decision that revealed just how completely Isabella had altered his priorities and his understanding of what constituted victory in his long war against her. "Family, I'm calling Marco," he announced over breakfast, his voice carrying a determination that Isabella had never heard before. "To negotiate?" Isabella asked, though something in his expression suggested his intentions went beyond simple bargaining. "To end this," Alessandro replied, "to offer him a choice that will give him everything he claims to want, while allowing me to preserve what I've discovered I can't live without." Isabella studied his face, noting the absence of the cold calculation that had previously marked his discussions of strategy regarding her family. "What choice?" she asked quietly. Alessandro reached across the table to take her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become natural over the weeks they had spent talking, arguing and gradually falling in love despite every rational reason to maintain emotional distance. "I'm going to offer to release all my evidence against him in exchange for his public acknowledgement of my father's innocence," Alessandro explained. "Complete vindication for my family name, full disclosure of the conspiracy that destroyed my father, and Marco's resignation from the district attorney's office." Isabella felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of his offer. "And in return? In return, I give up my quest for revenge against him personally," Alessandro said. "I stop pursuing criminal charges against his co-conspirators. I cease all operations designed to undermine his career, and I allow him to retain his freedom and his life." "That's extraordinarily generous," Isabella observed, "considering what he did to your family." Alessandro's smile was gentle but tinged with sadness. "Revenge doesn't feel as important as it used to," he admitted. "Not when I have something more valuable to protect than my father's memory." Isabella felt her heart race as she realized he was referring to her, to their relationship, to the possibility of building a future together that would require him to choose love over vengeance. "What about me?" she asked. "What happens to me in this negotiation?" Alessandro's expression grew serious, weighted with implications that went far beyond the immediate resolution of their family conflict. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether you want to stay with me voluntarily, or whether you want me to return you to your old life and disappear from your world forever." The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, forcing Isabella to confront feelings and choices she had been avoiding since the moment she realized she was falling in love with her captor. "Alessandro," she said carefully, "if I stay with you, what kind of life would we have together? What kind of future could we build given how we met and the empire you've constructed around the pursuit of revenge?" Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, his expression suggesting he had given considerable thought to exactly these questions. "I don't know," he admitted, with an honesty that made her chest ache with love for his vulnerability. "I built this empire to serve a single purpose, and if that purpose is fulfilled through negotiation rather than warfare, I'm not sure what comes next." Isabella studied his face, seeing not the dangerous criminal who had orchestrated her kidnapping, but a man who was confronting the possibility of redefining his entire identity around love rather than vengeance. "What do you want to come next?" she asked gently. Alessandro looked at her with an expression of such tender longing that it took her breath away. "I want to become the man you see when you look at me," he said simply. "I want to use the resources I've accumulated to build something constructive rather than destructive. I want to wake up every morning knowing that I'm worthy of the love you've given me instead of wondering when you'll realize that I'm still the man who was capable of kidnapping you." Isabella felt tears gather in her eyes as she realized that Alessandro was offering not just to end his war against her family but to transform himself entirely for the chance to deserve her love. "You don't have to become a different person for me," she said softly. "You just have to remember who you were before grief convinced you that revenge was more important than redemption." Alessandro moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for handling something precious and fragile. "Isabella," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I never wanted vengeance. I wanted justice. I wanted acknowledgement that my father was a good man who died for refusing to participate in corruption. I wanted the world to know that the Romano family name meant integrity and honor, not crime and betrayal." Isabella saw tears in his eyes as he continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "But somewhere in the process of pursuing that vindication, I became someone who was willing to cause the same kind of pain to innocent people that had been inflicted on my family. I became someone who could justify kidnapping a woman whose only crime was being related to my enemy." Alessandro's grip on her hands tightened as he struggled to articulate feelings that had been building for weeks. "You changed that," he said finally. "You reminded me that justice without compassion is just another form of cruelty. You showed me that love is more powerful than hate, that redemption is more valuable than revenge, that becoming worthy of someone's respect is more important than forcing the world to acknowledge past wrongs." Isabella felt her heart race as she realized that Alessandro was not simply declaring his love, but revealing that she had fundamentally altered his understanding of what made life meaningful. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Alessandro's expression grew determined, mixing vulnerability with the kind of strategic thinking that had built his empire and sustained him through 15 years of planning for this moment. "Now, I call Marco and offer him terms that will give him everything he needs to protect himself and his career," Alessandro replied. "And then I ask you to choose whether you want to build a life with a man who is committed to becoming worthy of your love, or whether you want me to disappear, so you can return to the world you knew before I disrupted it, with my need for justice and my complete inability to resist falling in love with you." Isabella stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering and the courage it took to risk everything he had worked for on the uncertain possibility that she would choose him over the safety and simplicity of her previous life. "Alessandro," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "ask me again after you've made the call to Marco. Ask me when you've proven that you're willing to choose love over revenge, redemption over vindication. Ask me when I can be certain that the man I've fallen in love with is stronger than the grief that created him." Alessandro nodded, understanding that she needed to see him follow through on his promise to prioritize their relationship over his quest for vengeance before she could commit to a future that would require both of them to trust in possibilities neither had ever dared to imagine. But would love be enough to rewrite blood debts? The betrayal came from within Alessandro's own organization, orchestrated by someone who had spent years earning his trust, while secretly working to position themselves to inherit his empire once he was eliminated or imprisoned. Isabella discovered the conspiracy by accident, overhearing a phone conversation that revealed plans to ensure that the upcoming confrontation with Marco would result in Alessandro's death rather than the negotiated resolution he was planning. Carlo Ventura had been Alessandro's lieutenant for 8 years, rising through the ranks of the organization through demonstrated loyalty, strategic intelligence, and a willingness to handle tasks that required both discretion and ruthless efficiency. He had been present during some of Alessandro's most vulnerable moments, had access to his private communications, and possessed detailed knowledge of every aspect of the empire that Alessandro had built around his quest for justice. But Carlo had also been methodically positioning himself to take control of Alessandro's operations, building relationships with rival families who would benefit from the Romano organization's resources, without its current leadership's obsession with vindicating past wrongs rather than maximizing present profits. Isabella overheard Carlo's conversation with these potential allies while she was walking through the villa's gardens, the sound of his voice carrying through open windows as he discussed timelines for Alessandro's elimination and strategies for managing the transition of power that would follow. "The boss has become a liability," Carlo was saying to someone on the other end of the call, His obsession with the Moretti family is interfering with business operations that generate millions in revenue each month. Worse, his growing attachment to the woman is making him soft, willing to negotiate instead of eliminating threats. Isabella felt her blood run cold as she realized that Carlo was not just planning to betray Alessandro, but intended to kill her as well to prevent any complications that might arise from her knowledge of the organization's operations. Tomorrow night's meeting with Marco Moretti provides the perfect opportunity, Carlo continued. We allow the confrontation to escalate into violence, ensure that both Alessandro and the woman are killed in the crossfire, and present the situation to law enforcement as a gang war that eliminated several problems simultaneously. Isabella remained hidden in the garden until Carlo concluded his conversation, her mind racing through implications and options with the kind of analytical thinking that had served her well in medical emergencies. She needed to warn Alessandro about the conspiracy against him, but doing so would require her to reveal that she had been eavesdropping on private conversations and might possess information that could compromise his organization's security. More significantly, warning Alessandro would force her to confront the reality that protecting him had become more important to her than securing her own freedom, that she was willing to risk her life to preserve the life of the man who had kidnapped her, but had somehow also become the center of her world. When Isabella found Alessandro in his study, reviewing documents that he planned to present to Marco during their upcoming negotiation, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and certainty. Carlo is planning to betray you, she said without preamble. Alessandro looked up from his papers, his expression immediately shifting to the kind of focused alertness that had kept him alive in a world where trust was often fatal and paranoia was a survival skill. What did you hear? He asked quietly. Isabella told him about Carlo's phone conversation, providing as much detail as she could remember about timelines, co-conspirators, and plans for ensuring that the meeting with Marco resulted in Alessandro's death rather than successful negotiation. He's been building relationships with rival families, Isabella concluded. People who want to inherit your resources and operations without your commitment to pursuing justice for past wrongs. Alessandro absorbed this information with the kind of analytical calm that had built his empire and eliminated numerous threats over the years. But Isabella could see the pain in his eyes as he processed the reality that someone he had trusted implicitly had been planning his destruction for months, or possibly years. Why are you telling me this? Alessandro asked. Why risk your own safety to warn someone who kidnapped you and has kept you prisoner for weeks? Isabella looked at the man she loved, seeing not her captor, but the person who had shared his music, his pain, and his dreams for redemption with someone who should have been his enemy. Because, she said simply, I love you. And because losing you would hurt more than anything Marco or Carlo or anyone else could do to me. Alessandro stared at her, his expression cycling through amazement, gratitude, and an intensity of feeling that made her pulse race despite the danger surrounding them. Isabella, he said, moving closer to her, you realize that warning me about Carlo's betrayal makes you complicit in whatever actions I take to protect myself and neutralize this threat. Isabella nodded, understanding that she was crossing a line that would make her Alessandro's ally rather than his unwilling prisoner, that she was choosing his survival over her own moral comfort with the methods he might need to employ. I understand, she said firmly, and I accept the consequences of that choice. Alessandro reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing her cheek with such gentleness that the gesture seemed almost reverent. You amaze me, he said quietly. You have every reason to hate me, to want me dead or imprisoned, to celebrate any betrayal that might result in your freedom. Instead, you risk your own safety to protect me from people who want to eliminate both of us. Love makes people do unexpected things, Isabella replied, leaning into his touch despite the circumstances that surrounded them. Alessandro's smile was tender and beautiful, transforming his entire face with joy that seemed almost incongruous given the gravity of their situation. Yes, he agreed softly. It does. But the moment of connection was interrupted by the sound of vehicles arriving outside the villa, the kind of coordinated approach that suggested Carlo had accelerated his timeline and was preparing to implement his betrayal earlier than Isabella had overheard. "They're here," Alessandro said grimly, his expression shifting back to the cold calculation that had kept him alive through years of similar threats. Isabella felt fear course through her system as she realized that the conspiracy against Alessandro was unfolding in real time, that her warning might have come too late to prevent the violence that Carlo had orchestrated. "What do we do?" she asked. Alessandro looked at the woman who had just proven that her love for him was stronger than her concern for her own safety, the woman who had chosen to stand with him against enemies who threatened both their lives. "We survive," he said simply. "Together." Was his greatest weakness now his greatest strength? The confrontation that followed tested every aspect of Alessandro's strategic thinking and Isabella's courage, as they worked together to survive the betrayal that threatened to destroy everything they had built between them. Carlo had indeed accelerated his timeline, bringing armed men to the villa with instructions to eliminate both Alessandro and Isabella before Marco's scheduled arrival, then present the deaths as the result of a failed kidnapping that had escalated into violence. But Alessandro had not survived 15 years in a world of shifting alliances and deadly competition without developing contingency plans for exactly these kinds of internal betrayals. Within minutes of the attack beginning, he had activated security protocols that transformed the villa from a comfortable residence into a fortress designed to withstand siege conditions. Isabella found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined, serving as Alessandro's partner in strategic decision-making rather than simply a prisoner to be protected. Her medical training proved invaluable in treating wounded security personnel, while her analytical intelligence helped identify escape routes and defensive positions that maximize their chances of survival. "How long can we hold them off?" Isabella asked as they took shelter in Alessandro's private study, surrounded by the evidence he had spent 15 years collecting. "Long enough?" Alessandro replied, though his expression suggested their situation was more precarious than he wanted to admit. Carlo made the mistake of attacking before Marco arrived, which means he's operating without law enforcement backup and with limited personnel. Isabella studied Alessandro's face, noting the cost that years of living under constant threat of betrayal and violence had extracted from him. "What happens after we survive this?" she asked. "What kind of life can we build when it requires constant vigilance against people who want to kill us?" Alessandro paused in his examination of their defensive options, looking at the woman whose love had given him reasons to want survival beyond simple revenge or vindication. "I don't know," he admitted with characteristic honesty. "This world, the empire I built, the enemies I've accumulated, the methods I've had to employ, none of it was designed to accommodate love or partnership or the possibility of genuine happiness." Isabella moved closer to him, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes as he weighed immediate survival against long-term possibilities. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "it's time to leave this world behind." The suggestion seemed to catch Alessandro off guard, forcing him to consider alternatives he had never allowed himself to imagine. "Isabella," he said carefully, "even if we survive tonight, I can't simply walk away from 15 years of empire building and enemy making. There are obligations, debts, and threats that would follow us wherever we tried to hide." "What if you didn't have to hide?" Isabella asked. "What if you could use the evidence you've collected, not just to vindicate your father, but to expose the entire system of corruption that made your empire necessary in the first place?" Alessandro stared at her, processing the implications of what she was suggesting. "You're talking about full cooperation with federal authorities," he said slowly. "Complete disclosure of my operations. Testimony against every corrupt official and criminal associate I've dealt with over the past 15 years. I'm talking about choosing redemption over revenge, justice over empire, love over everything that came before tonight," Isabella replied with quiet conviction. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marco Moretti and a team of federal agents who had been coordinating with law enforcement to rescue Isabella and arrest Alessandro for kidnapping. But instead of the simple law enforcement operation they had planned, they found themselves in the middle of an armed confrontation between rival criminal organizations. What followed was a three-way battle that ended only when Alessandro made a decision that surprised everyone involved, including Isabella. Rather than fighting to preserve his empire or attempting to escape with Isabella, Alessandro stepped out of the villa with his hands raised and a briefcase containing 15 years of evidence against Marco, Carlo, and dozens of other participants in the conspiracy that had destroyed his family. "Marco Moretti," Alessandro called out, his voice carrying clearly across the property where federal agents had taken positions. "I have information you need to see before you make any decisions about how this situation resolves." What followed was the most surreal negotiation Isabella had ever witnessed, as Alessandro calmly presented evidence of Marco's corruption to the same federal agents who had come to arrest him for kidnapping. The documentation was so comprehensive and damning that within hours, the operation had shifted from a rescue mission into a corruption investigation that would eventually result in dozens of indictments and a complete restructuring of the district attorney's office. But more significantly, Alessandro's cooperation with federal authorities provided him with the kind of legal protection that would allow him to dismantle his criminal empire without facing life imprisonment, transforming him from a target of law enforcement into a key witness whose testimony was essential for prosecuting corruption that extended throughout Chicago's legal and political establishment. "Why?" Marco asked as federal agents prepared to arrest him based on Alessandro's evidence. "Why give up everything you've built to help the people who destroyed your father?" Alessandro looked at his lifelong enemy, then at Isabella, who was standing beside him despite having every reason to distance herself from the criminal who had kidnapped her. "Because," Alessandro said simply, "I discovered something worth more than revenge. I discovered that love makes redemption possible, even for people who thought they had traveled too far down dark paths to ever find their way back to light." As federal agents led Marco away and began the process of dismantling both Alessandro's empire and the corruption network it had been built to expose, Isabella realized that the man she loved had just sacrificed everything he had worked for to create the possibility of a future they could share without constantly looking over their shoulders for enemies or consequences. "What happens now?" she asked as they watched the sun rise over the villa that had been her prison and had become the place where she discovered what love actually meant. Alessandro took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their silent declaration of partnership and commitment. "Now," he said quietly, "we find out whether love is strong enough to build something beautiful from the ruins of everything that came before. Will he choose his empire or his heart?" Two years later, Isabella stood in the garden of their home in Tuscany, watching Alessandro teach piano lessons to local children whose families could never have afforded private instruction. The man who had once commanded a criminal empire with ruthless efficiency now spent his days channeling his intelligence and resources into educational programs that served communities throughout rural Italy. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. Alessandro's cooperation with federal authorities had required months of testimony, debriefings, and legal proceedings that dismantled not only his own organization but the entire network of corruption that had made such organizations necessary for people seeking justice. Outside legitimate channels, the process had been emotionally devastating for Alessandro, forcing him to confront the full cost of 15 years spent pursuing revenge rather than redemption. But it had also provided him with something he had never expected to receive: genuine absolution from the families of people who had been harmed by his criminal activities. Forgiveness from communities that recognized his cooperation had made their neighborhoods safer, and respect from law enforcement officials who acknowledged that his evidence had exposed corruption they had been unable to address through conventional investigations. Most importantly, the legal resolution had given Alessandro and Isabella the freedom to build a life together without constantly fearing retribution from enemies or interference from law enforcement agencies. Isabella had resigned from her position at the Chicago hospital and joined Alessandro in Italy, where they had established a medical clinic that served rural communities with limited access to health care. Her trauma nursing experience proved invaluable in training local medical personnel, while Alessandro's resources allowed them to purchase equipment and supplies that transformed the quality of care available to families who had previously traveled hours to receive basic medical services. But beyond their professional collaboration, Isabella had discovered that living with Alessandro meant sharing life with someone whose capacity for love was as intense and focused as his previous dedication to revenge had been. He approached their relationship with the same analytical intelligence and strategic thinking that had built his empire, but channeled those abilities into understanding her needs, supporting her dreams, and creating environments where their love could flourish. "The children adore you," Isabella observed as Alessandro concluded a piano lesson with a group of 8-year-olds who had been learning classical pieces under his patient instruction. "They remind me why music matters," Alessandro replied, settling beside her on the garden bench, where they often spent their evenings discussing their work and their plans for the future. "Why beauty and education and the development of human potential are more important than power or revenge or any of the things I thought mattered when I was building an empire." Isabella studied his face, noting the peace that had replaced the driven intensity that had marked his features when she first met him in the role of captor rather than partner. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The excitement, the power, the sense that you were working toward some grand purpose that would vindicate your family name?" Alessandro considered the question seriously, as he did all inquiries that touched on the life he had given up for the possibility of redemption and love. "I miss the certainty," he admitted. "I miss knowing exactly what I wanted and having clear metrics for measuring progress toward those goals. Building a criminal empire is complicated logistically, but simple conceptually. You accumulate power, eliminate threats, and pursue objectives through methods that prioritize results over morality." Alessandro reached for Isabella's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their private language of comfort and connection. "But I don't miss the isolation," he continued. "I don't miss the constant calculation of threats and opportunities, the inability to trust anyone completely, the gradual erosion of everything that made life meaningful beyond the pursuit of power." Isabella felt her heart race with love for this man who had been willing to sacrifice everything he had built to become worthy of her respect and partnership. "And now?" she asked softly. Alessandro's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with joy that seemed to emanate from a place deeper than professional satisfaction or personal contentment. "Now, I wake up every morning knowing that I'm living a life that would make my father proud," he said. "I'm using the intelligence and resources he helped me develop to serve communities and individuals who need support rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities for personal advantage." Alessandro paused, looking at Isabella with an expression of such tender devotion that it took her breath away. "More importantly," he continued, "I'm sharing that life with someone who saw possibilities for redemption when I could only see reasons for revenge. Someone who chose to love me despite every rational reason to fear or hate me." Isabella felt tears gather in her eyes as she processed the magnitude of the transformation they had both undergone since the night he had kidnapped her and inadvertently begun the process of discovering what love could accomplish when it was stronger than the desire for vengeance. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying all the wonder and gratitude she felt at having found happiness in circumstances that should have destroyed rather than created the possibility of joy. "And I love you," Alessandro replied, his voice carrying depths of feeling that made her pulse race with recognition of how completely they had become essential to each other's happiness and growth. That evening, as they sat together in their garden, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and neighbors gathering for their weekly community dinner, Isabella realized that she no longer thought of herself as someone who had been kidnapped and held prisoner by a dangerous criminal. Instead, she had become someone who had been chosen by fate to love a man back to life, to show him that redemption was possible even for people whose pain had driven them to become everything they had never wanted to be. Alessandro had given up his empire, his power and his quest for revenge to build a life with her, but in the process, he had gained something more valuable than anything he had sacrificed: the knowledge that love could transform even the most damaged hearts into sources of healing and hope for others. "The world called him heartless," Isabella whispered, as Alessandro played softly on the piano they had moved onto the terrace for their evening entertainment. But she knew he was hers,